This is a special treat for me. I'm stepping in for Nicole Skarke, the Vice Chair for the Future Leaders Forum. Unfortunately, due to a family emergency, she had to leave yesterday afternoon. She had devoted more than 7 months of hard work in building this panel. So my job essentially is to just sit here and pretend like I know something and let these experts carry forward this conversation. The theme of this session is very interesting. It is also a very complex issue. The key word that's underpinning this session is empower. It means different things to different people. It could mean a lot of very different things. If you also dissect the word empower, it exposes a paradox. Does power come from within, or does it come from outside? What does empowerment truly mean? Those are some of the issues that undergird the presentations from our speakers here. We have a fantastic group of speakers. Tracy Chow, until recently an engineer at Pinterest, brings in a wealth of experiences from a diverse set of areas. Jeff Ecker, an entrepreneur and a terrific IEEE volunteer, and most recently the founder and CEO of Culture Cloud. And my final panelist here, sitting right next to me, is Lisette Titram-Comrie, a very talented video gamer and a fantastic engineer. Each of them bring in, as I said, a diverse set of experiences. First, we'll get to hear from Tracy Chow. And you may feel free to give her a warm New Orleans welcome at this stage.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Today, I'll be talking a little bit about diversity in tech. So in the last few years, discussion about diversity in tech, or the lack thereof, has reached a fever pitch. So every year now, the big companies put out their diversity data reports, although every year they also lament how little progress they've made. Tech conferences are always putting on diversity panels. Increasingly, there are initiatives, nonprofits, and organizations popping up to address different parts of the pipeline. Visibility and role models, CS Education for All, coding boot camps. Some programs are for students, some are for people transitioning careers, some are for women, some for underrepresented minorities. There's something for everyone. The thing is, none of these diversity issues that we're talking about are new. The homogeneity of Silicon Valley has been an open secret for a long, long time. In the last few years, though, some of the conversation has started to catch. Part of it may have come from an initiative that I worked on back in 2013. As frustrated as anyone else out there about the lack of diversity in tech, I wrote a Medium post calling for transparency of diversity data and set up a GitHub repository alongside it to crowdsource that data. And companies started to put it out there. And so as an industry, we started to establish a baseline of metrics for the demographics of the tech workforce, finally something concrete we could point to. And people outside tech could also see the problem without having to step foot on campuses in Silicon Valley. With the increased visibility of diversity issues, a few important discussion questions have emerged. One is how we got here, and why is it that we have such a lack of diversity in tech now? And another big one is why it even matters, and does it? I'll take the first question from a personal angle and talk a little bit about my story of getting into tech, because I think it's illustrative of the cultural issues at play. My path to a career in software engineering should have been straightforward. I grew up in Silicon Valley, the child of 2 software engineers with computer science PhDs. I went to high school in Mountain View, the land of Google. Later, I went to college at Stanford University, the birthplace of countless tech companies. During the summers, I interned at Facebook and Google. If anyone had a clear path to tech, it should have been me, but I didn't. The issue wasn't a lack of interest or ability. It was that the sexism I encountered had me convinced that I just wasn't good enough to make it. At Stanford, I only made it up to the introductory reader class before I decided against majoring in CS, because I felt like I was just too far behind my male classmates to ever catch up. I was intimidated before even starting the class, but then I met freshmen who had skipped the prereqs, they had done software internships in high school, and they just jumped straight in. As the quarter went on, my classmates bragged about how easy they found the class, despite what people had said, while I felt like I was constantly struggling to even keep up. Assignments that took me 15 hours, they would talk about finishing in 3. And I remember thinking that I was quantifiably 5 times worse than my classmates. And when the quarter ended, I decided that that was it for my CS career. The reader class had weeded me out, and I wasn't good enough to continue. The great irony there was that the next quarter that the class was offered, my professor asked me to TA for him. I thought for sure he was mistaken in asking me, and I pushed back a little bit, like maybe you've confused me for some other Asian girl, but he insisted, and it was too good of an opportunity to pass up, so I did it. The experience was a revelation. As a TA who was grading assignments and hosting office hours, I could see things from a very different vantage point. I'd always taken my classmates' word for it that they were coding geniuses, but now I could actually calibrate people's bragging to their actual performance, and if I had to be as objective as I could be about it, I wasn't so bad. It was too late then to major in CS, but I could, of course, still work in Silicon Valley, and I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to intern at places like Google and Facebook. Unfortunately, the workplace wasn't much better than the classroom. All of my existing and almost crippling insecurity was only exacerbated by a nagging suspicion that my coworkers welcomed me because they thought I was cute to keep around, not because there was any expectation of me doing useful work. At my first Silicon Valley internship, my co-interns and full-time coworkers were first friendly and then flirty. They tried awkward pickup lines and complimented me on the way I looked, not the work I produced. One offered to give me a massage because I looked stressed. Another suggested watching a movie in a conference room where we could lock the door and close the blinds. And later he gave me a custom-made t-shirt with his name in big letters across the front. And meanwhile, I had to scavenge for scraps of work because the big project I had been promised for my internship was given to somebody else. So the lack of diversity in tech isn't just because women and minorities aren't interested. There's a lot of fault in the culture itself for driving so many of us out, those of us who aren't white or Asian, nerds or bros. People have told me things like, pretty girls don't code, and I assumed you weren't very good at computer science because technical ability and physical attractiveness are inversely correlated. It's this death by 1,000 paper cuts. A large part of why I started writing and talking about issues of diversity in tech was the overwhelming distress and frustration that I felt as a minority and someone marginalized in the field. I found reassurance from a wonderful support network in the community, and others reached out to me to say that it was so powerful for them to know, too, that they weren't alone. That would have been enough to continue the conversation. But beyond that, the more I engaged with the subject of diversity, the more the business reasons for it stood out to me as well. Which brings me to that second question, the question of why diversity matters. There are still those who question that it does at all, or enough for us to invest any resources in it. In the context of innovation work, research demonstrates that diverse teams are more creative, more diligent, and thoughtful, and most importantly for the business case, drive better financial returns. And it's not just correlation. Controlled experiments show that having diversity on teams actually causes them to be stronger. It's impossible to do causal analysis on firms and industry, but the data there is still very compelling. A report released in February of this year, studying nearly 22,000 publicly traded companies across 91 countries, showed that an increase in the share of women in top management from 0 to 30% was associated with a 15% rise in profitability, which is a pretty clear business case. For the tech industry, we're building products and services for everyone. The quality, relevance, and impact of these products and services can only be improved by having the people who are building them be demographically representative of the people who are using them. Here's a glaring example of an oversight that probably would have been prevented by having some gender diversity on the team. Apple launched HealthKit in iOS 8 as this comprehensive app to track everything, nearly everything you can think of tracking about your health and fitness. Blood alcohol content, inhaler usage, sodium intake, except somehow they missed period tracking. Perhaps one of the most obvious uses of quantified self for women, and it's one that affects nearly half the global population, but they forgot it. There's another angle from which diversity is a strategic and competitive advantage, and that's hiring. Everyone wants to hire software engineers, and there isn't enough supply to meet demand. The Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that by 2020 there will be a shortfall of 1 million workers to fill computer science jobs. The tech industry is severely underutilizing the talent that exists in our economy with its systemic exclusion of certain sectors of the population. And it's pretty obvious that we need to fix this. Sometimes people ask me what I imagine for 5 years out or 10 years out. They ask if we'll have solved this problem by then. I think, unfortunately, that it is very possible that nothing changes, because not much has changed over the last few decades. The stories that my mom would tell me as a software engineer are still the same that I've experienced, and that was from 30 years ago to now. But it's also the case that we can work together to bring about the future that we want to see, and I think there is reason for optimism. We're at least seeing increased awareness and greater nuance in the conversations around diversity in tech. And while there is still a lot more that comes after that, there's a lot of momentum right now, and I'm optimistic that we can capitalize on it to drive some lasting changes and empower a much more diverse and inclusive population to participate in the tech industry. Thank you.
Tracy, thank you so much. Jeff, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. How you guys doing? Good? Yeah? Okay. So my name is Jeffrey Eager. I am from IEEE Region 2. Do we have Region 2 people here at all? Okay, yeah, that's good. So I'm going to follow up and, we're pretty good guys. So I'm going to follow up and talk more about IEEE as a diverse organization and a network full of resources and opportunities to take advantage of, and find some that you might not know exist. So I grew up in Haddonfield, New Jersey. I am from Rowan University, just graduated in May. I've been the IEEE Region 2 Regional Student Representative, and I'm the founder of Culture Cloud, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I'm going to start by mentioning something that is most important to everyone: your brand. I am, I have done, I will do. These are things that you need to define and answer to build your brand. And at every part of your career, whether you're just starting college or going through college, having a brand is something that you need to capitalize on. Everything that you dedicate time towards needs to be able to embolden and strengthen that brand. I use an example that I see from freshmen coming in often, and I'm sure that you see them as well. Freshmen don't get internships. It's a phrase that I've heard all too often. Every October, I go to the freshmen from the student branch that just joined and say, "Which internships did you apply for?" And too often the answer is, "I didn't." Freshmen don't get internships because they don't apply for internships. I'm often shocked when a freshman comes up to me and says, "I don't have a resume." Make a resume, and then go to someone who's older than you and have them review it. They'll give you tips and they'll talk you through the interview process as well. They've gone through internships a couple times. And as someone who's a junior or a senior who has been in a new job for a couple years, go back to someone who's just starting and help them out. That generosity is important, and it'll come full circle. If you can make a resume, you can make an elevator pitch. And an elevator pitch is the most important tool you'll have. What's your name? Where'd you go to school? What was your major? Did you compete in any competitions? Did you take any classes? Did you do any projects? Were you team lead in any of those projects? Did you present? Oh, you've done those things. I can't tell you how many times I fired those questions off to people and recited the answers back to them in the form of their elevator pitch. Once you have an elevator pitch and a resume and can answer the questions of I am, I have done, I will do, you have the fundamental core to your brand. You are qualified for something somewhere. So what is that something? It's kind of fun to do the impossible. We live in a world of impossible possibilities, or so some people would think. So when you go out and you try to do these impossible things, how can we empower ourselves to accomplish them? Especially in light of a tough boss, stiff competition, or bad grades. My answer is always stop. Look around, observe, talk to everyone. Everyone. Learn as much as you can. When you go out there and talk to people, you'd be amazed at the different opportunities that you can unlock. I once even made a connection to get an internship while talking to the person behind me in line at a marching band banquet, and ended up getting me an internship. You never know who you'll run into and have that valuable opportunity who's hidden right around you. And by the way, IEEE has 420,000 members, split across several membership levels, several affinity groups, 46 different councils and technical societies. IEEE brings in several $100 million a year, has 1,100 employees and countless volunteers. There are programs that these people support: Volt, Epix, SpaX, the list goes on and on. There are resources out there for you. You have to go and find them. How do you find that buried treasure of the resources that can really aid you as you move forward. One of the things that I always really like to mention is when you go to these IEEE events, make sure that you talk to people and find out what's going on. So, for instance, when I was so I was a sophomore in college, and I was in a public speaking class. Apparently, people think that engineers don't know how to talk to normal people. I have no idea what they're talking about. It was a tough competition. The person who was voted best speech ended up not having to take the final exam. So I went a little overboard, and I met the guard at the front door that morning as he unlocked the building, and I walked in, and I taped golden bars to the windows as I drew the blinds down, and I put candy below everyone's seat. And this was a lot of work, but it was worth it. As I was going through the speech, I was able to make some great quips. As I raised the shade, I said, "There's golden opportunity outside the window. All you have to do is look out." And I was able to say at the end of the speech, sometimes you don't even know the sweet opportunities that you're sitting on. And no, I did not hide candy under your seats, although I think I saw someone over there looking for it. What you have to realize is that all those people I mentioned in IEEE wake up early and stay up late to make a great organization. Whether it's the resources that you have to go around asking for and researching, or the fundamental local, national, and international network, those resources are out there. If I wanted to go and get a job in Sydney, Australia, I could look up the contact information for the New South Wales section and say, hey, are there any job opportunities out there? And I could get a job in Australia because of IEEE. IEEE has a section in every single corner of the globe. That is hugely powerful. And you need to use these opportunities to be able to look around and talk to people and say, okay, what have I done and who do I know and how can I take the people around me? Look to your left, look to your right, the person behind you. What do they do? What have they done? What resources are they aware of? And how can they help you further your brand? How can you help them? One of the examples of randomly meeting people for IEEE was on the streets of Berlin. I remember exactly where I was walking down the streets of Berlin, sort of talking geek about IEEE, and a big, tall, smiling man behind me said, IEEE? I just started an IEEE student branch. His name was Matt, and he was from Australia. We wanted to be able to take the power of the international perspective that we were gaining studying abroad in Germany, living with host families and visiting industry locations, and give that back to our student branches back home. How do you do that? And as we went through this process, I realized my personal brand is to spread the power of international perspective. So throughout the next year, we had to have a lot of asks. We had to ask people for resources, help, volunteerism. Through competitions, seminars, and projects, we were able to convey the value proposition of that international perspective enough to send 10 people to Australia in the May of 2015 to visit industry locations, shadow people academically, and understand the culture that was there. And this all came from just a chance encounter. Who knows what chance encounter you'll make here? While I was there, I ran into somebody who mentioned a conference that was coming up sometime in the region. It was pretty big apparently, and I kept on inquiring and learning. Turned out that conference was the IEEE Region 10 Student, Young Professional, and Women in Engineering Congress, showing the diversity across this huge region. I'm from Region 2. We represent a couple states in the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States. Region 10 is all of Asia and Australia, a large, diverse group of people. And looking and talking to the representatives and volunteers there, I realized there are so many different things that occur there versus what we do in our region. And seeking to go after that perspective and understand how could I further our organization, our Region 2 student activities, to fight really what's a declining membership in Region 2 and a problem with retention versus an exponential growth in membership in Region 10. So I went there and then I was able to apply those at our region conference this year. Hugely valuable. Keep your eyes open and look for these opportunities. While I was there, I ran into a young engineer who was from Indonesia and eventually invited me to speak at her TEDx. And this was supported by Rowan University, growing as they went onto the international stage. An opportunity that I didn't think that I would be able to do. I made some asks and eventually I was able to do it. Ask the question, it's always worth it. And going through and interacting with all these people around the globe gave me the opportunity to pursue my brand, my passion to spread the power of international perspective through a startup company. So I've always had the opportunity everywhere I go to be able to have someone who shows me the amazing things all around me in a culture, helping me escape the loop between the hotels and the tourist traps through IEEE, through studying abroad, and through that international partnership with the Australian student branch. and several other examples, I was able to give that to a couple people. How could we give that to the world? And so what we created was this project, which allows people to literally place themselves on the map. They're indicated by the flag of their home country. Click on that flag, shows their passport profile, languages they speak, interests they have in places they've been in the world. You can instantly connect with locals and fellow travelers who share your interests to gain perspective of the places that are around you. This is wildly important and something that I'm really proud to do, and we're excited to be launching it, I guess, in Rio. So what it comes down to is the big ask. What is your big ask? And through this presentation, you'll notice that it was a slow build. There were lots of little asks all along the way, and there's no silver bullet. There's 10,000 of them. You have to keep on trying. It's not going to be an easy road. You're not going to be able to get a lot of yeses right away, but there are the resources out there. Turn to your right, turn to your left. Talk to the person behind you. Build your brand, build your passion, and chase after it. The big thing that you should be asking is, what are you going to ask? So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Jeff, thank you so much. IEEE indeed is a transformative force in many lives, and I think the way you expressed it, I think it's also a tool for empowering new possibilities and networks. So thanks for sharing your passion with us today. Sure. Lisette Montgomery, you have been named one of the most powerful women in the tech industry by Business Insider. We are all curious to know, hear what you have to say. It's all yours.
Okay, great. See, I'm not. I just wanted to thank my previous presenters. Thank you for giving us some insight into your work experiences. I just wanted to come here today to tell you a little bit about my growth path, running an entire game development studio and working with artists and engineers and game designers. I've been a game developer for over 15 years. So I know a lot of you are starting out in your career, so I wanted to hopefully save you guys a lot of pain and frustration by giving you some points of what I've learned throughout that process. I worked at very large companies and very small companies, and I believe all of these principles follow you and are all the same. So I can't stress this one enough. I think coming into a job with this is my job and this is what only thing I do is a big, big hurdle that you're gonna have to get over. It's better to approach it as wearing many hats. I came in as a character artist in one of my studios, and I immediately, whenever I had downtime, began learning more about other disciplines. How all the elements of a game come together, how all of the assets in the game get into the engine, and how each department owns and runs and all the interconnectivity. And learning all of those different steps led me to have the skills that I needed to be able to run an entire team at a game development studio and also learn how to work with others so we could scale. So it's extremely important to learn other skills in your downtime. And one of the benefits of this is that the Swiss Army knife rarely gets let go. I was at EA for 6 years, and I survived 7 layoffs in those 6 years because I was seen as a Swiss Army knife. They could put me anywhere, and I could handle anything. So it's an extremely important skill as you're developing your career. I also try to look at problems through an empathetic lens. I think we tend to approach problems on software and in the game development industry by trying to attack the problem, but it's important to look at it through empathy. Empathy is a really strong lens to approach problems with. It helps you walk in other people's shoes to understand where processes are breaking down. It also leads to insights and innovation. So I approach problems with empathy rather than going to look for blame. So it's very important to approach problems at work with a lens of empathy. And most importantly, understanding equals efficiency. You're not going to find ways to improve your processes or your code and how inter-department connectivity problems are happening if you don't have an empathetic lens and you don't understand how problems are affecting other people. This is an important case, being bold and pushing boundaries, especially if you are entering as a junior or a new career or professional in an established company. It can be extremely difficult being the new person in an established company because senior management can be very set in their ways. You'll get the mentality, if it's not broke, why are we trying it a different way? And that is not going to lead for a space where you can shine. So a lot of times you kind of have to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. I've approached challenges with software that we've dealt with where this established senior team just wants to work a process a certain way, when I know and I've experienced that there's a different way to approach it. So rather than ask for permission where I know I'm going to get shot down, I just solve the problem, and then I ask for forgiveness. Most of the time, if you solve the problem, nobody cares. They're just happy that you found something. So it's important when you're starting in your career and you're finding that people are treating you like you don't know what you're doing, to just show and tell and prove that you can do it. It's also really important to reframe problems. A lot of embedded thinking happens in established companies, so you kind of have to reframe the problem and focus on the problem and the solution and not the process. This is important, especially when you're starting your career, to really take stock once you've been at the company for a few months and look at the culture that you're in. As Tracy mentioned earlier, she was in a situation where she was not being enriched. Her position was not taken seriously, and she was not valued. And it's really important to acknowledge when that's happening to you. So CEOs and the founders of the company set the culture. If you're finding that the culture is not inclusive to you, then it may be time for you to start looking at other places. Also, most importantly, is your superior. Is your direct report or your superior supportive? If your superior is not supportive, there's very little chance you're going to be able to grow your career in the company. So I find that a lot of people who get comfortable, they have a stable job, and they talk themselves into staying into a position that they may not necessarily be able to grow out of. That is a huge career mistake. So please take this step back emotionally from what you're going through and really look at the culture of the company and how you are treated as an individual. And it's really important to remember when you can't polish a turd. Once again, trying to tell yourself that you could stay here, if you work really hard, somebody will notice. I can guarantee you they will not. Trust your gut. If your gut is telling you something is wrong, do not lie to yourself. Also, if you're working with a superior that is always negative, nothing you can do is ever good enough, even though you know you're doing 100% of your effort, that's called gaslighting. And it's really bullying. And now you're dealing with a bullying, toxic situation. Know when it's time to move on. Do not waste more of your precious talent in the wrong place. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and start talking about some of the techniques that I use on my creative teams. Like I said, game development is highly collaborative. There are artists, game designers, engineer, tech artists. There's just a multitude of different personalities that have to work together to execute on features. So one of the most important things that I do are brainstorming sessions with my teams right before we start really digging into work. And this is really the critical point where you start to shape the vision of what a feature or software experience is going to be. So I make sure that everyone who is a stakeholder, even if it's the most junior person on the team, is in that room, and that everyone has a space for their ideas. Post-it notes are great for this. Everyone takes a few minutes at the beginning of that session, writes everything that they think is a great idea on paper, and each person gets equal time to share those ideas. That way you're not letting the most dominant negative person in the room take over the conversation. Also, once again, I'm in a very creative field, video games. It's important to draw something. If you're trying to illustrate an idea, even if it's a process flow that you're putting on a Post-it note, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Even if you suck at drawing and you can only do stick figures, at least it's an illustrative point. It's the most important part is getting your ideas across. Also, as part of my meeting sessions, I like to encourage strange and wild ideas. Not because I like wacky thoughts, but mostly because it helps us shape the real vision of what we're trying to get after. If we start getting in and start allowing negative and nitpicky ideas to come at that stage, then the idea will never really fully form. Then you just kind of get this mediocre sort of feature or a very mediocre section of a game. So you really kind of have to encourage wild thinking and ideas so you can kind of get to the meat of what you're trying to develop. And once again, asking open-ended questions. If someone comes across with a wild idea and you just don't have any idea where this idea is coming from, instead of picking it apart, ask, well, how would you approach this? Or why did you think that this idea was important? Asking a lot of open-ended questions when you're at this development stage is very important to really begin innovating. This is by far the most important part of meetings for me, is having very solid rules about communication. I think it's extremely important to have solid communication rules for teams, so that way people who are on the team, whether they're introverted or extroverted, feel that they have a space. My first rule is no interrupting. If you're in the middle of a conversation and Bob jumps in, I will immediately say, I would like Joanne to finish what she's saying. It's extremely important to let people feel that they can be heard. The next point I like to use when I run my team is give credit where credit's due. Once again, you get quiet, introverted people who may mention an idea, and then 2 minutes later, the most extroverted person says it, and now all of a sudden people think it's his idea. If you notice that happening, just give credit where credit's due. Be like, yeah, that is a great idea when Bob said it. It's very simple. It's not rude. You don't have to interject, but it does create a culture of respect within the team. And the last point is having this sort of attitude and enforcing those rules, either whether you are a new professional or a manager, it also makes you look good. Like being the person who sets a culture and creates a space where people feel included makes you look like a supportive coworker, a positive person, and an ally. So when there are real trouble, people feel that they can come to you. So these are some really important rules that I use in setting the culture within the studios that I work with. Thank you.
Let's turn the lights on for a second so we can have a good discussion on this topic. It's just fascinating, right? We heard three very different perspectives, three different views. One on the importance of diversity in technology, one on the importance of brand building in technology, in this case even individual brand building, and the role of professional societies like IEEE. And finally, Lisette, what you said, one of the most compelling things that I learned from your presentation was the importance of empathy. I mean, really understanding where the other perspectives are coming from. And that is something we don't pay enough attention to, or we are not even given academic grades for that. So I think that comes from life experiences. So thanks for sharing that with us. We will take, I think, just to encourage quality discussion here, we'll take about 4 really, really good, crisp questions. So please line up. I'll warm up the speakers here by asking a question. As I just summarized, you had 3 very different perspectives on what we can broadly call empowerment. And your individual lives have been driven by some form of an empowering goal. You have enough life experiences and networks to think about that. What has been your individual empowering goal, or what has been a driving force in your life? So maybe we can start with you, Tracy.
The thing that drives me the most is taking advantage of the opportunities and privileges that I have to make the world a more equitable place, which does sound like a very lofty goal. There are a few attack angles on this. Some of it is through the work that I've been doing around diversity in tech. The other angle is actually through building products from the angle of being an engineer. So the next thing I'm going to be doing, I left my job at Pinterest a couple months ago. The next thing I want to do is actually work on a tech startup where I can apply technology and the experiences I've had in building software as an engineer and working on product to address some problem that is right now very underserved by technology, because it's a problem of a demographic that is not historically represented in the tech industry. And I'm being a little bit vague because I haven't quite gotten ready to announce what I'm working on. But that is kind of the empowering goal for me. Is like I have had so many advantages growing up in the Bay Area, having parents who cared about education and put me through school at a really good university that opened a lot of doors, and all the compounding privileges that come out of that, the internship experiences I've had, the workplaces I've been in. I just want to take advantage of all that I have and pay it forward.
Very good. Jeff?
Yeah, I guess one of really the most empowering things that got me along the path that I'm on started in 12th grade. I was tasked to write an essay on the definition of one word. So I went to all of my friends, family, and teachers and asked for one word. I got words that were fun, words with dual meanings, really crazy words. And then I asked my friend in Germany who was learning English at the time. She spent a long time typing on Skype, and I got a little concerned. Eventually she wrote miracle. It's all the small things around us every day that we take for granted. All I had to do was take one step out of the fishbowl of my hectic Northeastern society to someone peering in, trying to learn my language and culture, to understand what was valuable all around me. So since then, I've really tried to utilize really every opportunity I can to learn perspectives that I wouldn't have seen before, and it's been a good road so far.
That's critical, yeah.
I think for me, what has driven me has evolved. 15 years of doing the same thing, your goals and you grow. I think when I first started, I was interested in storytelling. I saw games as an amazing medium, an immersive medium, rather than being a passive observer. You can be an interactive observer and participate in stories. So I was driven by stories, and that's what got me into game development. But now, my work with nonprofits have really driven me to improve the access for non-represented members of society to have access to computer science and STEAM education. So a lot of my nonprofit work has been focused on trying to create areas of access and solve the pipeline problem. So once again, it is still been driven by storytelling, but now I want to empower people who are marginalized to have access to game development skills to tell their stories as well.
Lovely, thank you. We said 4 questions, and we have 5 enthusiastic volunteers here. We'll take the first question from here, and we'll address all the 4 after that. Please, introduce yourself. Where are you from?
Hi, my name is Ami, and I'm from New Jersey. I go to Stevens Institute of Technology. That was just kind of a 3-part question. Was
A 2 or 3 part? One part.
it's kind of just all goes together. It's how do you deal with all the difficulties you've dealt with and use that to make your brand? How do you define who you are by what you do and how you teach people and being empathetic? Like, how does that all kind of blend together?
Resiliency of some sort? Bringing back to action? Go ahead. Who wants to take a shot?
I'll take a shot. Let's see. Building a brand does take time, but I think it has to be driven by ultimately what your goals are. If you approach your brand like a celebrity would, you may not get the same results as if you have a altruistic or a very particular goal in mind. So shape your brand based on your goals, not necessarily what may look good on Facebook.
So I think I inadvertently built a brand around being a woman in engineering and being a woman in tech by being very authentic about the experiences I've had as a woman in technology. So I started talking and writing about this whole space of problems when I was at Quora. And back then, when I was at Quora, we were a very tiny company. We're building this new platform, and we wanted people to be using it for questions and answers, and so all of us as employees would just go write answers all the time. And the one area that I felt like I could write a lot of answers in was about being female in tech, because I could at least give that experience. And it wasn't a deliberate attempt to craft a brand, but just by being authentic, that became part of my brand. And what I realized in doing that and being very honest about the struggles that I've had is that people engage with that authenticity. And I'd speak on panels and talk about how difficult it was for me, even going to a good school, having good grades, and having good internships. It was still very difficult for me, and I would have so many people respond to it. It's like, oh, like now I know, like when you said the words imposter syndrome and explained what that was, like now I understand what that was. Now I understand what stereotype threat is, and because I was very honest about the difficulties that I had, people engaged, and it felt more resonant than if I'd been on stage saying, like, everything's going to be great, like, it's so easy, like, just, like, keep going and power through and fake it till you make it and all that stuff. I think by being very honest, people just identify with that, and that helps much more to build the brand, although I still feel a little bit weird talking about things in those terms. It feels a little bit too crafted. I think by this point, because I just am very honest with everything I write and what I tweet, and people just engage with that more easily, and find that even though I am like blasting out thoughts to, I don't know, tens of thousands of people, it still feels like a real person.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Tim Warboys from Silicon Valley. Diversity is clearly an important thing, and as you mentioned, it kind of has to come from the leadership, the culture of the company. And you've got a captive audience of the leaders of tomorrow here. What is it that the leaders of tomorrow can do to create a culture of diversity and inclusion in their companies?
Great question.
Yeah, I can jump on that. I had an internship once, and it was the most impressive company that I've seen in terms of a program for diversity and inclusion. Basically, they mentioned one day they sort of woke up and realized, wow, all of our managers are middle-aged white men, and is that affecting our workplace culture? And so they brought everybody together at their headquarters, and they had a meeting, and they went around the room and asked many, many questions. I had the opportunity to participate in one of these seminars, and it blew my mind that I didn't even realize some of the things that they were trying to awaken people to. And one of the questions that they asked was, of everybody in this room today, how many of you have gay or lesbian employees? And about half of them raised their hand. And they went around the room and said, okay, do you feel as though those employees feel comfortable in the workplace? And most of them said yes and described why, or maybe there's some issues and described them. And then at the end of it, the consensus was yes, they feel comfortable. But then the moderator asked, okay, of those gay or lesbian employees, how many of them show pictures of their significant others at their cube? And none of them raised their hand, none of them did. So it's a matter of looking deeper into just the superficial issues and trying to understand things that are hiding in the background, I think. Keeping a broad perspective and always asking the questions over and over again to make sure that that culture exists in the proper way, and asking the people who actually work there.
One of the projects that I've been involved with recently is called Project Include, and it was a group of 8 of us, women in tech, Ellen Pao, Frida Kapor-Klein, Erica Baker, a few others, and we were really interested in this question of how do we help companies build inclusive cultures, and it's not going to be one silver bullet. People want to hear like, oh, I just do one thing, I can just use the Rooney Rule and make sure I interview one African American and one female candidate, then everything will be okay. People want to hear those silver bullets, but there aren't silver bullets. And so for the 8 of us in Project Include, we wanted to write down all of the experience and expertise that we had as women in tech. And amongst the 8 of us, we have 150 collective years of working in the tech industry. And we try to put down a comprehensive framework of solutions around diversity and inclusion. And so they're very pointed things. Some of them are at a certain size, you should be hiring an HR manager. At a certain size, you should be hiring somebody in charge of diversity and inclusion. When you set up interviews at any stage, you should have rubrics and make sure that everything is structured so you don't have as much opportunity for bias to creep in. There's a lot of different things that go into building a good culture that is diverse and inclusive. I think it's, in a lot of ways, just as hard as the general question of culture. You can't just go up and say, like, how do I build a good culture and expect like a one-line answer. There's probably like a new blog post every day on Hacker News about how to build a good company culture. So there's lots of different opinions and lots of different ways to go about it, and lots of little insights that you can string together to pull together a really good culture for your company. But I think it has to be very thoughtful. It has to come from the top down, because there has to be that empowerment from the top.
I think it's also important to approach where you're looking for candidates. I think if you keep fishing in the same pool, you're going to keep getting the same fish. And if we keep going to Stanford and if we keep going to MIT, I mean, those channels are already getting narrowed with who gets accepted. So we, as a culture of tech, need to start looking in other places for people who may have those skills, but may not hit all of the check boxes that you would from an MIT grad. So I think a lot of it is starting to look outside of the networks that come within the company and actually start looking at different locations for talent.
That was a great question, and we got a set of great answers. Thank you. Who's next?
Hi, my name is Jeffrey McDaniel from Region 6 Foothill Section. Actually, with your diverse answers to the last question, this seems really great. You guys have talked a lot about the inclusive environment and encouraging an inclusive environment within the workspace to include minorities. What are your thoughts on widening the sort of pipeline, as you said, Lizette, to get more people from diverse crowds into it, like people, young girls in 5th grade stop being interested in engineering, to get more people into it to a tipping point where now the diverse crowd is the norm versus, preparing the workplace environment to be inclusive for when they get there so they can stay without feeling that pressure to exit and to leave. So what are your thoughts between those two approaches, sort of inclusive environment first versus pipeline into that inclusive environment?
I think these efforts have to proceed simultaneously. So some of the pipeline stuff is going to be more of a long-term effort, and there are organizations like Code.org, which is trying to bring CS education to K through 12 across the United States, and they're not explicitly trying to promote diversity, but by getting everybody to do CS, then the classroom is now going to be 50-50 male-female, and it will have proportionate representation of African American, Latinx, Asian, and white. So that's kind of the long-term angle, but that takes many years before those people will even get into the workforce. Simultaneously, in the workplace right now, there are pretty well-documented culture issues, and the exit rate of women and minorities is much higher. There isn't as much research around underrepresented minorities, and I tend to know more of the research around women, but it's, I think 41% of women in tech will leave in a 10-year period versus 17% of men. So women are exiting at more than twice the rate of men. And even if you factor out things like family issues, which are endemic to all of business and industry and government and all of that, what's happening is a lot of women are leaving the tech industry to go be self-employed or work at other places or other industries. It's not just that they're exiting the workforce. So there's something pretty clearly wrong with the culture. And so some people will describe this as like, yes, it's a pipeline problem, but the pipeline is leading to a sewage plant. So we shouldn't be sending all the women into a sewage plant. So we need to solve both problems simultaneously. And given that the pipeline issues will take a longer time to resolve, I think we need to right now also be working on industry issues.
Next.
Hi, I'm Shruti from Region 3, and I'm actually leading the Women in Engineering Affinity Group from the Eastern North Carolina section. One thing that I have faced in my experience is that whenever we try to organize events or to engage people in the universities, we are trying to engage the entire demographic. But the people that we end up engaging are usually just women, because more than half of the demographic shies away from the diversity in tech issues. And it is often taken as very trivial and not very seriously. So have you guys faced any such issue while you were studying, and how do you think we could counter that? Or
So I can use an example. I'll take a step back, and actually forming the group itself, a We Affinity group at a university that I'm familiar with, they actually had a Society of Women Engineers group there, and they also wanted to form a We group. And actually they've created a really good model of combining the resources of the two groups. One of them did more technical tutorials, and one of them brought in speakers. And by, again, just reaching out and bringing in those different resources and pairing with the IEEE student branch, at the first meeting, they had a big IEEE meeting, and everybody came, and then right afterwards, they said, we're not even gonna have a break, we transition right into the We student branch. After the first year, they had the same issues that you were describing. And then that second year, when they had everybody just go straight into that meeting, everybody understood, wow, there's really big value in this as well, and they were able to convey that value proposition a little bit better. And so that's one case study that might be a good idea to attempt.
Thank you.
I'll quickly answer that as well. So when I was in school, I actually very steadfastly did not participate in any women's activities. So I did not participate in the Society of Women Engineers, and I didn't join the women's groups because I felt exactly as the questioner had just said. I didn't think that it was necessary for me to be in the women's groups, and it felt a little bit trivial. I didn't know why I needed to associate with a group of people just because we had the same gender. It took me a while to understand that because all of the industry and all of the educational system and all of society is so biased against women or these underrepresented groups more generally, it makes sense to have these dedicated affinity groups, to have these support networks that can counteract some of the more prevailing tendencies overall. And it's not just an issue for the people who are marginalized. It can't just be the people who have been oppressed trying to fight the oppression. It has to be the people who are complicit in oppression or in the dominant groups generally to be allies and supportive. So this is more of like a broader theory around social change, but some of the success of the LGBTQ movement has been in getting straight allies on board. If it had just been the LGBTQ community fighting, they would never have been able to affect the changes that have been able to pass in the last few years. And so similarly around these issues of diversity, it can't just be the people who are marginalized that are fighting for it, it has to be the allies as well. Obviously, getting people who are in a position of privilege to engage with that can be difficult because people don't necessarily want to acknowledge that the success that they have is not purely due to their hard work. It's very difficult for people to confront the idea that they may have been successful, more so successful than others around them because they're white or Asian or born into privilege. But it's a difficult conversation that we need to keep having so people understand how to engage with it and come to terms with that discomfort and help to dismantle these structures.
Take the final question.
Hi, my name is Julian. I'm from the Houston section. My question's sort of been answered to an extent by the previous questions. But, okay, so my question is, what do you think is the main step that companies should take to try and increase diversity in the workplace? And do you think that race and gender should be a factor in hiring decisions?
Sorry for monopolizing. I have lots of opinions. So I think the next big step that a lot of companies have to take is to set goals and create accountability for those goals. And some of that is having metrics and actually understanding what the metrics are. Before, a few years ago, no companies even had metrics. And it just seemed kind of crazy to be in the tech industry where everything is so data-driven and to not have metrics around something like the workforce. But we're starting to get there where we're tracking some numbers. Most companies are not yet setting real goals around them, or they set fuzzy goals and don't put anybody accountable for those goals. Once companies actually start firing people based on not meeting those goals or rewarding performance based on hitting those goals, I think we'll see a lot more movement much more quickly. In terms of making race and gender part of hiring decisions, that's a very difficult conversation to have. And when I've broached it, it tends to come across very negatively. People have a lot of negative associations with affirmative action, and it violates people's idea of the meritocracy. They get very offended by this notion that we would hire somebody just based on race and gender. I think the way to frame it for a lot of tech companies is to say that we'll set hiring goals, but not necessarily quotas. And so the difference there is that we won't hire a bunch of people just to fill a quota by the end of the year, but we will try very hard to hit these hiring goals by increasing top of funnel, and some of that may mean looking beyond the normal pools that we're looking at, so not just the Stanford, Harvard, MITs, but also looking at people from different backgrounds, not just CS majors, people who are self-taught or are transitioning from other careers. People who don't exhibit the same sorts of like checklists that we have been looking for traditionally will just get broader in considering the candidate pools. But actually a counter argument to not setting quotas, that quotas are actually very effective. Like there's been a lot of research in different countries that shows that setting quotas actually increase the quality of candidates. I think it was one of the Scandinavian countries that set some quotas around, I think, parliamentary leadership or corporate boards. And when they did that, there was one, it was a zipper rule, so it was like if you have one male candidate or one guy in power first, then it has to be a woman next, and then a man next. They saw that the overall quality of the people serving that position was higher. So what happened before was that women would look at the predominantly male tenures there and think, oh, this is not going to be a fair contest anyway, so I'm not even going to apply. And so the role ended up being filled by men who were less qualified than the women who could have been there. So quotas actually have been shown to increase the quality of candidates filling roles. It's just a very difficult conversation to have, and when so many people have opinions, it can be difficult to get that sort of societal sea change. And so what I've seen to be more successful is setting hiring goals as opposed to quotas, but it kind of depends on the company.
Any other comments?
Sure. I think there are various ways companies can improve. I do think that they need to point their resources toward nonprofits that are actually solving the problem. I think there's a lot of challenges in the pipeline, and companies who have the resources really should begin investing. Everyone knows that Code 2040 is a very popular organization, and they're actually working to grow people with CS degrees because this population of the United States is going to shift drastically over the next few years. So there is a business case why it's time to start investing in these organizations. And also I do think that we overlook the importance of internships and where we pull our interns from. Once again, if we're going to Stanford, MIT, we're going to keep getting the same kind of candidates. So working with historically black colleges and universities that have more diverse candidates, you'll start to get internships and they'll get those valuable skills that they'll need to get a job later on. So I think it's a very, very complex problem and there's no silver bullet. And as far as considering race, as someone who is a hiring manager myself and I've hired full teams of artists, it's never going to be the first factor, and I think anyone who does use that as a factor is being foolish. Of course, you're looking for someone who can come in and do the job, and that's what I qualify, who I'm going to consider for hiring and internships and interviews. But secondly, it is also about what culture they're going to bring. So if I sense that they're going to bring a negative attitude toward my team, I don't care where they come from, I'm not going to hire them. Also, if they're going to bring a positive attitude and an insight and a life perspective that may not be present on the team, I'm going to value that as well. Because what really makes our creative games go are diverse ideas, and those come from diverse people.
Very good. Before we get to the summary statements from each of you, I just want to say that I work in Washington, D.C., which means that anyone who can wear a black suit can claim to be an expert in pretty much any field. And I hear ideas, policy prescriptions all the time about how to improve diversity and all these things. But what I heard today from you three is far more realistic, refreshing, and actually practical. And I want to personally thank you all for sharing your perspectives in a pretty direct and compelling way, and greatly appreciate that. A round of applause for our wonderful panelists here. There are about 300 people in attendance. We have CTOs and top program managers, upper management from major corporations. We have about 5 or 6 former IEEE USA presidents. We have some senior leaders in this group. What message would you like to deliver to them on this stage based on the conversations we have had today?
I would say that thank you so much for creating what is a global network in IEEE full of diverse people, and let's continue to utilize that. It's a really powerful tool, and everybody in this room has the opportunity to go out and now will be in the seat as they become managers and as they go further even to become executives of companies to make decisions that will impact not only individuals but entire company cultures. Ask the question, more even than in just hiring. When you hire a contractor, when you work with another company, don't just talk about the contract details, talk about what their inclusive environments are like, and build off of the experience that you can gain from IEEE interacting with the different organizations, technical societies, and affinity groups that we've established and already have accessible to you right now all around the world.
Sure. I'd like to say that diversity is a very important issue, not because it's altruistic, but because there's a business factor. The culture of the country is going to shift. The population is going to become minority dominant, and you're not having a staff or a team that reflects that is going to stifle innovation. And you know what happens to tech companies that don't innovate. So it is very important for us to really start tackling this problem from all sides. And because you're not a minority does not mean it's not your problem.
The thing that I love about being an engineer, and I think this room is all full of engineers, is that we get to build the future, and that's pretty cool. Like, we get to think about what the world we want to exist looks like, and then we can actually try to make it happen. And this is very true in the technological realm. It's very obvious to us as engineers that that's the case. Sometimes when it comes to diversity, though, people think, oh, this is just too hard to fix this problem because it's a human problem. I think if we bring the same sort of innovation and creativity to bear against a problem diversity and building a really inclusive workplace, the same sort of tenacity and creativity that we bring to engineering, and we take that and apply it to building a more inclusive workplace, we'll be able to make it happen. It shouldn't be harder to hire black people than it is to build self-driving cars, but that's apparently what's been happening in Silicon Valley. And the more we can include diverse demographics in the building of the future, the better that's going to be. And some of the argument against spending a lot of time in diversity is you look at some of these very successful companies like Apple and Google, and they've been very successful without being diverse, right? So it's sometimes hard to make that argument. I think what we aren't seeing, though, is how much better the world could be if we included even more perspectives. Like, there's just so much that we're missing out on. We don't even know what we're missing out on because we aren't including the perspectives of people from all different backgrounds. So just, I guess my like takeaway is, if we can take that same sort of like engineering creativity that we use in our normal engineering work and apply it to building a really great engineering workforce, we'll be able to see really cool gains in the next few decades.
Friends, let's thank our speakers for their brave insights. Thanks so much. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks so much.